Well, hello plant lovers. It is Matthew in Melbourne. Thank you very much for finding me in this crazily crowded YouTube universe. If you're interested, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without any help from greenhouses or grow lights or greenhouses, just me and them inside or outside or not at all. So plant lovers of the world, if that sounds like your conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every Friday. My ramblings are amateurish and often lead to the compost bin, but bear with me and subscribe if you want to see what could be happening next. And what is happening next is I am going to be looking at a group of orchids that I've had in some cases for a while and in some cases are quite new, and just talk a little bit about my failures and perhaps understandings now of this group of orchids. And they are dendrochilums, and there is 4 here, so we might just go and have a look at all 4 and learn a bit where they're from, and then figure out perhaps what I've been doing wrong, what I've been doing right, and what I am going to do. And I must thank a viewer of mine that suggested I have a look at a new orchid channel, well, newish, called Howard's Orchids. And Howard is a grower out of Cambridgeshire in the UK, and he grows sort of cool intermediate orchids in a greenhouse in Britain, and grows many similar things to me that I can grow outside, kind of protected, but essentially outside. So I was thrilled to find someone who's growing similar things to me, slightly different conditions, but nonetheless. And he had a video about dendrochilum, and I thought, aha, perhaps everything will be explained. And it kind of was, because I now realize a few mistakes, and I'm going to see if I can right those wrongs. But in fact, the name doesn't exist anymore because these have all been subsumed into the Coleogyne family, which is hilarious when you look at that and think, my goodness, that looks about as much like a Coleogyne as a geranium. Anyway, taxonomists, they need to keep themselves busy and awake at night. Anyway, let's just stick to dendrochilum, I think, because it will be confusing, I think, for the amateur in me to call these Coleogynes. But before we go through them all, dendrochilum, although it's now a synonym and not the actual name of this type of orchids, dendrochilum means dendron, which is Greek, meaning tree, as in epidendrum and dendrobium, and chilios, meaning lip, which is to do with the shape of the flower. So essentially an orchid that grows on a tree and a lip that's quite conspicuous in the flower. Anyway, that is where the now redundant name comes from. And the dendrochilums are sort of spread throughout Southeast Asia, but all of these 4, funnily enough, all come from the Philippines, which is an orchid hotspot and somewhere I would love to go, because very broad variety of growing conditions there, and these are all high altitude plants, which means despite the fact they come from the Philippines, they can take cool conditions. Okay, so the first cab off the rank is this one, Dendrochilum cobianum, and I've had this for quite some time. High altitude Philippine dendrochilum, and it named after Mr. Cobb, as many orchids were, not after Mr. Cobb, but after a Mr. Now, this one has quite pronounced pseudobulbs, as you can see. So this actually does look a bit more like a Coleogyne, so I get this. And the flower, now you can see I've had a bloom this season, emerges from the emerging new pseudobulb, so quite early in that stage of growth. And you've got this beautiful leaf, and the flower comes sort of out the middle of the leaf. But as you can perhaps see, here is a dead new growth that didn't mature. And just a plant that, you know, isn't bursting with health, let's say. Now, what I am just going to do is snip off that old flower spike, and I'm going to snip off these growths that didn't make it to maturity. Why, I hear you cry? Well, I've realized there are 2 things with dendrochilums that I haven't really had my eye on. The first thing is they're high altitude and they grow in moist, damp, bright forests. So high altitude, lots of cloud cover. So although it's quite bright, it's actually very protected, if you know what I mean. It's like being under permanent shade cloth, but bright light. So you have all that airborne moisture and all that precipitation, bright light. So these orchids do like to be kept moist and bright and cool. Now, the bright and the moist I can do. The cool, I Generally I can, but summer can get quite warm here in Melbourne, and these orchids are undercover, and it's a polycarbonate roof which does raise the temperature a bit more on very hot days. So it is something to bear in mind for me with things like Masdevallias, for example, which I can grow outside as well. So these are outside all year. They sail through the winter minimums, but this one just never thrived for me. I had one bloom this year, but I actually had 3 growths, so I should have had 3 blooms. And the spikes are very pendulous and beautiful, a little sort of trailing wand of beautiful sort of ivory coloured flowers with a delicate fragrance. So I have decided, first thing is, I potted this quite some time ago, so I'm going to repot it and just make sure that I've got a slightly better moisture retaining medium, which I'm going to mix, and we'll do that in a minute. The next thing is I'm going to put this in a spot where it gets a bit more indirect bright light, because I think that is what this plant is missing in its life. Okay, so that's Dendrochilum cobbyanum. It has pendulous racemes of flowers which are a beautiful ivory colour and off-white ivory and fragrant. So this one is another quite famous one, and it is called Dendrochilum wenzellii. There you are. And this one has very upright spikes of quite red flowers. Once again, from the Philippines, slightly lower elevation, so it is described as warm to hot. However, I bought this from a local grower, and she grows hers in the same conditions of mine. So quite cold winter nighttime minimums, but undercover, protected from rain. So although it is a warm to hot grower, this one can take Melbourne's conditions. Now, this is the time of year when, if it was going to bloom, it would. And the flowers, like this one, emerge from the new growth. And if we have a look in here, we might be able to see those very lime green, fresh shoots. So there's lots and lots and lots of new growth coming out of this plant. So we'll have to see if I am going to get any luck with this one this year. The leaves on this one are much tougher and much stronger, almost succulent-like actually. It feels a little bit like an agave leaf in some respects. It's quite strong and quite hard. Anyway, I am giving this bright indirect light, and I am keeping this one moist, and so far it seems to be happy growth-wise, but of course that does not mean flowers. So let's keep an eye on this one. I've only just repotted it, so I am not going to repot this one today. This, I think, is happy. Next cab. Now, I bought this one about a month ago, and it is Dendrochilum, and this tag says Haviarii, but it is actually Haviarinum, because taxonomists and their decisions about who things can be named after and how. Anyway, named after Mr. Javier, and it is now Haviarinum. So this one was in bloom, and as you can see, dead spikes again, which I will remove. And these are really golden, very gold and very upright, but the similar kind of form you can perhaps see from the dead spike, that you have a series of small flowers along the raceme. So let us just snip this off so that all these orchids are going to look beautiful as I repot them. Now this one is in a little plastic pot, so I am just going to repot it as it's spring and it's finished flowering and it seems a good time. I can't see any new growth on this one, but that's okay. So Dendrochilum Haviarinum, we are going to repot. This has bloomed, winter flower, so I had nothing to do with the blooming. We'll have to see if I can make it happy enough to bloom next year. Once again, Philippines, high altitude, likes bright light, but again, you have to kind of define that. Bright light, but lots of cloud cover and moisture, which kind of protects and filters it from direct sunlight. So figure that one out. Anyway, bright indirect light, moist, cool conditions. And then lastly, this one, Dendrochilum tenellum. Ta-da! And I bought this one literally because it looks like grass. It does not look like an orchid. Quite amazing, isn't it? A really, really interesting form. And this one blooms in autumn and winter. And I only bought this one, when did I buy this one? About 3-4 weeks ago. So it's, missed its season, or it was too young to flower, or perhaps it had flowered and it was over by that point anyway. So it's going to be a question of seeing if I can get this one to bloom. So once again, high altitude Philippine grower, but higher than the others. So it can take cold, cool temperatures. Once again, brightish indirect light, moist and cool. So again, similar conditions. So I think what I have to do is just find that beautiful spot where these are going to be bright, cool, and moist, because this one particularly, I think, has been kept in the dark like a mushroom and needs to come out. Okay, well, I'm going to flip the camera around and I'm going to pot up these two in terracotta pots, and I'm going to repot my old Dendrochilum cobianum because I'm just not sure what I potted it in, as I bought this in the early days of my career and it might not be in an optimum mix. So flip the camera and let's get on with some potting. Okay, so let's start with our mix. I'm going to use an interesting mix. I'm going to use out of the bag orchid mix, which is a real mix of different size pieces of bark and a little bit grittier. I'm going to use sphagnum moss, and I'm going to use a smaller bark size as well, and I am going to use perlite. So all of this together will create aeration, but not too chunky a mix, and lots of moisture retention for the quite fine roots of all the Dendrochilums. So I'm just going to chop up my sphagnum moss so that it's quite small and just a little bit easier to work with. Okay, so to that mix I am now adding my out of the bag orchid mix. Now I'm adding my perlite into the mix. This is like making dough. And then my slightly finer bark. There we are. Okay, mixing this all together. So let's start with our smallest little friend, which is Dendrochilum Haviarianum now. Its name has changed, and let's just see what's going on inside the pot, shall we? There we are. So you can see, shake all that off. There we are. Quite happy roots. So you can see, I think, that this was a division. That's where it's been cut. And there we are. So not bad. Quite a healthy looking plant. And nothing particularly wrong with that bark. So I'm just going to include that in the general mix. Let us just include that. Let's just put a little bit of that in there. What I always put in my newly potted orchids is a slow release fertilizer, which has a 6-month release. Just a few granules of that. A few sprinkles of mycorrhizal fungi, which just helps promote fantastic root growth and develops a symbiotic relationship with the plant, the roots, and the nutrients and moisture in the medium that it's planted in. So we'll just pop that back in there. And as with most orchids, this is an epiphyte, so you want to try and keep the pot as small-ish as possible to accommodate the roots of the plant. So there we go. Pop all that in there. Give it a little tap. There we go. That is a very handsome little Dendrochilum. Now with all of these, I'll give them a watering with a seaweed-based solution, which is diluted to about 1/10, just to settle them in. It's not a food, it's a tonic, just to water in that mycorrhizal spore, and also just to settle the roots in. Ta-da! On to the next. Okay, pot number 2, orchid number 2, Dendrochilum tenellum. This is that amazing grass-like one. Let's see what's going on in here. Now this one is potted in a much more terrestrial mix. You see, that is basically just like regular potting mix. Quite aerated though, with lots of perlite. And then you can see those quite beautiful fleshy roots. So this is a very healthy plant. Now I'm not going to disturb that too much. And once again, I'm going to use a little bit of this with a little bit of my mix. Popping that in there with some slow release fertilizer, with some mycorrhizal fungi. In goes the plant. And then we will just backfill around it. There we are. Dendrochilum tenellum, very happily repotted. And now let's have a look at my cobianum. I am going to use the same pot as the size is fine, but I'm just curious as to what I had this in. Let's have a look. Well, not the most fabulous of root growth, although that's all quite healthy. Some old sphagnum moss there. Perhaps see why it's not thriving. The roots aren't particularly fabulous. Now, I don't know if you can see, but it was in a very, very loose mix, and I think that was perhaps just too loose for the plant. So we are going to put that aside and pot it back in my not as loose mix. Some slow release fertilizer and some mycorrhizal fungi. There we are. Now let us put this back in here. And actually we have an old pseudobulb there, which is probably the original. Oh, there you go. It's just come off when the plant was divided. So there we go. All right. We might need a bit more of that. And there we are, Dendrochilum cobianum repotted. And there is the tag. Well, there we are, plant lovers. Many thanks to Howard of Howard's Orchids for inspiring me to just take a look at my dendrochilums again and just think, am I really doing the right thing by them? Don't think I was. And interestingly, the only one that I've had for some time, Dendrochilum cobianum, is the one that had the least developed root system and perhaps the least happiest of plants. So I have clearly not been doing right, even though it did manage to bloom for me this late winter, early spring, but only one flower spike. So there we go. I feel I have turned a page with Dendrochilum. I am happy that I've repotted all these now heading into spring. So let's just see what happens. This one, Wenzellii, could, well, we're coming into the blooming season for it, so if it flowers, I will let you know. The others have passed. This one had flowers for me. This one bloomed once. This one, no, I think it blooms a little earlier in the season. Anyway, we will touch base again with these all in a year's time and see how I've gone. Hopefully, better results next time. So if you have enjoyed my very amateur ramblings, as you can see, with Dendrochilums this week, then do hit subscribe because I post every week on a Friday. And I am curious to know what we'll be talking about next week. Something of great import in the orchid world, I hope. But until then, I hope all's well in your orchidy world, and I look forward to seeing you next week.